Lesson 21, Religious Wars in the Second Half of the 16th Century. Overview and the French Wars of Religion. This part will concentrate on the overview. Remember the Schmalkaldic Wars in Germany and the compromise with the Peace of Augsburg. This established that in Germany that the prince would decide the religion of his principality, whether he be Lutheran or Catholic. That's how his principality would go. Henry VIII's essentially Catholic Church of England, where he cuts off the Pope, he becomes the head of the Church in England, he changes very little doctrinally, very little ritually, it's pretty much the Catholic Church, but he's the head of the Church instead of the Pope. The French persecution of Huguenots, which will cause Calvin to end up in Geneva, where he gets around a bunch of more radical Protestants, comes up with stronger arguments for his ideas, pushes his ideas, leads Geneva, and spreads Calvinism. Edward VI, he takes over when Henry VIII dies, whereas Henry VIII only established the Church of England basically so that he would have a male heir, Edward VI. And Edward VI is a young king. He is greatly influenced by his advisors. They are Protestant, and they make the Church of England more Protestant, although it's certainly not some sort of Calvinist Mecca at this point. And then we get to Mary I, Mary Tudor. She is going to take over when Edward dies, and she is Catholic. She will return England to Catholicism. She'll burn 247 Protestants at the stake. A bunch of Protestants will flee England, go into exile, basically into places in Germany and Switzerland, hiding out, waiting for a change. The first half of the 16th century, the religious conflict was centered in Central Europe. This was the time of the Schmalkaldic Wars. This was the time when Charles V, pictured here with all of his enemies defeated by him, including an Ottoman Sultan. He is in charge, large in charge, taking on the Schmalkaldic League, the Lutheran princes, and eventually having to reach a compromise with them. The second half of the 16th century, these would be the Calvinist Wars of Religion. Only the Lutherans were recognized in the Peace of Augsburg, along with, of course, the Catholics. So therefore, these new Protestants called Calvinists, they are not recognized. In fact, the Lutherans don't really care for them that much. And the Jesuits in 1563 will really be turning up the heat against Protestantism wherever they can. Remember, the Jesuits were formally recognized back in 1540 in the Council of Trent, and now they're thoroughly entrenched as a weapon and a powerful institution within the Church. 1564, by this time, because of this counteroffensive, because of the difficulties Protestants are having, Geneva in Switzerland has become a Protestant refuge and is going to be just kind of this factory for new Protestants. So let's compare Calvinism and Catholicism. Calvinism and Catholicism are both dogmatic. That means that they have doctrines and belief systems in place that they absolutely believe and argue that if you're going to be Calvinist, you have to believe these things. If you're going to be Catholic, you have to believe these things. They're uncompromising. They're aggressive. And this means that they're trying to spread their ideas. They're trying to ratchet down in areas where they're the majority and maintain their position and spread whichever doctrine they hold to. Now the difference, a big difference between the two, is how they are organized. Calvinists, the church, Calvinist church, is decentralized, with elders known as presbyters. That's where the term Presbyterian church comes from. Represent individual congregations. Catholicism is extremely hierarchical. There is an order of ranking, if you will, stressing obedience to the Church in Rome and the Pope. It's very centralized, therefore. And then we get to the art, and we can see some of the differences between Baroque art, which is kind of identified with Catholicism. It's very colorful, it's grand, it's still holding on to some of those classical themes that are used in the Renaissance, and then you have this more restrained, kind of realistic, kind of darker approach that you see a lot, and by dark I just mean literally they use a lot more shadows in the art that's kind of identified with being kind of more Calvinist or more Protestant. Intellectuals. Intellectuals, by this time, it had centuries of this kind of new kind of outlook, this Renaissance outlook, and Lorenzo Valla with his proving that the donation of Constantine was a forgery. So they support, and also they have had the experience of watching these bloody wars, especially in Germany with the Schmalkaldic Wars. So they support religious pluralism. They're going to support toleration. By the way, if you don't remember what religious pluralism is, it means that you have a society where there's more than one religion that is practiced and tolerated. And skepticism is, of course, something that has been building in intellectual circles for a few centuries. Skepticism basically means that you try to prove the argument. You research an argument. You check your facts, even if it comes from a traditional source of authority like Aristotle or Plato or the Pope. You go back and you make sure that the facts line up so that you can actually, kind of work with their argument. So you don't take things on the faith of whoever said it. You go back and look it up. Relativism. After all, you have Lutherans, you have Calvinists, you have Anabaptists, you have Catholics, of course, and so there's a beginning of a kind of a movement among intellectuals that, perhaps truth is more relative than people want to believe. Maybe it's not so black and white. Maybe Catholics aren't the only people who are saved. Maybe Calvinists aren't the only people who are saved. Maybe Lutherans aren't the only people who are saved. And individualism is going to become more respectable as it has been moving toward with the Renaissance itself and the humanistic movement of the Renaissance. Here's some of the intellectuals who were more into religious pluralism, more what we would call open-minded today. Castellio, to the left here, he is a guy who criticized John Calvin for his part in the execution of Servetus, an anti-Trinitarian, someone who denied the Trinity. Montaigne, the guy who came up with the essay, hope I said his name right, he challenged dogmatic thinking. He basically, his response is something to the effect of, what do I know, if you will. So that's paraphrasing, but basically he's saying, how can you be sure you know anything? I don't pretend to know everything or to be completely convinced that whatever I believe is the absolute truth. So therefore he argued that point toward others as well, that how can you be so sure of Weigel, he thought that one should look within for religious truth. So he's arguing that, maybe it's not reading some tract from some theologian, whether it be a pope, or it be Luther, or it be Calvin. Maybe you need to search inwardly and meditate on it and read the Bible for yourself and come up with your own idea of what religious truth would be. I'm not so sure he'd be very popular with either Calvinists or Lutherans or Catholics, but there you go. Rulers. Some rulers supported toleration and moderation. These rulers were called politiques. And politique is Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I is going to take over after Mary I, Mary Tudor, passes away. She's going to come in, she's going to restore Protestantism in England, but at the same time she's definitely not trying to persecute the Catholics. And we'll get into the intrigues and all that about Elizabeth later on, her dealing with this kind of Catholic Cold War espionage going on in her country. But for now, the thing to remember is she's a politique, she's tolerant, and she's going to be quite successful as a ruler. These rulers, Philip II of Spain, Mary Tudor, Oliver Cromwell, we haven't studied him yet, but in the future, in the middle 1600s, we'll get to Oliver Cromwell, Lord High Protector of England. And these are leaders who try to create religious uniformity, and it doesn't work. They are less than successful as a result. Here we see them, Philip II and Mary Tudor, Oliver Cromwell over here to the right, and these are some of the folks who just really couldn't accept religious pluralism. And then we get to study these wars of religion here soon. Both civil wars and international wars, what that gets at is that these are going to be wars within a country, and oftentimes these wars within a country are going to lead to other countries' involvement. After all, all these European countries are competing with each other for colonies, for markets, and they have this kind of history of competing with each other, and these various dynastic families, these royal families that control this portion of Europe and this other portion and so on, they're trying to play a big game of Monopoly with Europe as the board, and this is going to create situations where they're going to get involved in other people's religious civil wars. Catholics and Protestants are going to compete for France, the Netherlands, and Britain, and every major European nation will be drawn into, draw should have an N on it, but it doesn't, would be drawn into the 30 Years' War in one fashion or another.